July 23, 1885. Mount McGregor, New York. A dying man sits propped in a chair by a window, too weak to walk unaided, too stubborn to stop writing. Ulysses S. Grant, the general who had helped win 2 wars, is fighting his last one, and the enemy this time is the clock. He can barely speak. Cancer has nearly taken his voice, but his hand still moves across the page. He is dying, he is nearly broke, and he is racing to finish a book before his body finishes him. What happens in these final days will decide whether his family is provided for or left with almost nothing at all. Just a few years earlier, Grant was one of the most admired men in America. He had led the Union to victory, the general who once demanded unconditional surrender at Fort Donelson and got it, a phrase that stuck to his name for the rest of his life. He served 2 terms as president. He had shaken hands with kings and emperors on a 2.5-year world tour, cheered by crowds in London and Cairo and Tokyo, a private American citizen treated like visiting royalty. Crowds gathered just to look at him. He seemed untouchable. Then in 1884, everything collapsed. Grant had trusted a young Wall Street wonder named Ferdinand Ward, the young Napoleon of finance, with his family's money and his name, lending it to the firm of Grant and Ward to help it attract investors. Ward was a fraud, running what amounted to a Ponzi scheme dressed up in fine tailoring. His investment firm was a house of cards. When it fell in May of 1884, it took Grant's life savings with it, every dollar, leaving him with barely $80 in cash. Worse, just before the collapse, Ward had persuaded him to borrow $150,000 from William Henry Vanderbilt to keep the firm alive. The hero of Appomattox was suddenly, humiliatingly, broke and deeply in debt. Then came worse news. Grant had smoked cigars for decades, sometimes a dozen or more a day, gifts from admirers by the crate ever since Fort Donelson made him a household name, and grateful citizens started mailing him boxes of them. That summer of 1884, after eating a peach at his cottage in Long Branch, New Jersey, he felt a sudden, searing pain in his throat, a sensation he later compared to swallowing something sharp. When doctors examined him that October, they gave him a diagnosis that felt like a death sentence: cancer of the throat and tongue. The pain became constant. He used a cocaine solution on the affected tissue just to get through an afternoon, and sipped brandy to dull what the cocaine couldn't reach. The man who had commanded armies of hundreds of thousands could barely swallow his own food. He was dying, he was penniless, and he had a wife to think about. So Grant picked up a pen, not for glory this time, for Julia. He had already dipped a toe into writing, penning several articles for Century magazine series on the war for $500 apiece, and discovered he had more to say than a magazine piece could hold. So he decided to write his memoirs, a full account of his early life and his wars, and he decided to finish them no matter what it cost him. The Century Company offered to publish the book, sensing a hit, because everyone in America wanted to read the words of the man who had helped end the rebellion. It offered him a routine deal, the kind many authors might get, a standard 10% royalty, respectable, unremarkable, ordinary terms for a man who had helped save the Union. The pain got worse. His voice thinned to a whisper, until he often communicated with his own family by scribbling notes on scraps of paper rather than risk the agony of speech. Some days he could only write in pencil, page after page, propped up in bed with a shawl around his shoulders even in the heat of summer. Other days a stenographer or his son Fred would sit with him while he dictated or wrote out what he remembered: the muddy roads before Shiloh, the quiet at Appomattox courthouse, the long marches nobody but a soldier could describe. Still he kept going. Doctors urged him to rest. He refused. He knew exactly what was happening to his body, and he knew exactly how little time it left him. He wrote that he felt under the same obligation to finish the work that a soldier felt to remain at his post. By early summer of 1885, the city heat had become unbearable for a man this sick, so the family moved him north, to a cottage at Mount McGregor in the Adirondack foothills near Saratoga Springs, a cottage offered through wealthy banker Joseph Drexel. Picture it. Full summer outside, birds and green mountains and resort guests down the mountain going about their vacations. And inside, a dying general wrapped in blankets, shivering, writing by hand because it was the only weapon he had left. Photographers snapped pictures of him bundled on the porch, a scarf wound around his neck to conceal the swelling, and those images went out across the country, so that all of America watched, week by week, as their old general visibly faded. Would he even live long enough to finish a sentence, let alone a book? Here's where the story turns. Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, already one of the most famous writers alive, and now a publisher through the firm Charles L. Webster and Company, heard about that ordinary offer Grant had been given, and he was furious on Grant's behalf. This was the man who had helped save the Union. Twain believed the book deserved better, and so did the man writing it. So he stepped in personally, visiting Grant and laying out much richer terms, Grant's choice of a straight 20% royalty, or 70% of the net profits, a share so generous it was almost unheard of in publishing at the time, a deal built on faith, both in the story and in the storyteller. Grant chose the profit-sharing option. For the first time in months, Grant had reason to believe this fight might actually pay off. The question was no longer just, will he finish? It was, will Julia actually be taken care of when he's gone? Summer wore on. Grant grew weaker by the week. His throat closed further, until swallowing water was a project and swallowing food was nearly impossible. He was surviving on little more than milk, broth, and liquid nourishment by the end. Talking became agony. And still, propped up on that porch at Mount McGregor, he worked, wrapped in a wool cap and shawls despite the July warmth because the disease left him constantly cold. Family gathered close now, watching a soldier fight a battle with no maps and no retreat. He revised pages he could no longer read aloud, passing them silently to Fred or to Twain's associates for a final check of the facts. He pushed through pain that would have stopped most men months earlier. He was almost there, just a little further. Then, in the third week of July, 3 days before the end, he did it. Grant completed his final review. The manuscript was finished, 2 volumes, nearly 300,000 words, the entire arc of his story from boyhood in Ohio to the surrender at Appomattox. The last battle of his life had ended not in surrender, but in a period at the end of a final sentence. He had bought his family's future. Now all that was left was to say goodbye. On July 23rd, 1885, shortly after 8 in the morning, with Julia and his family gathered at Mount McGregor, Ulysses S. Grant died. He had done what he set out to do. He had won. What happened next was almost unbelievable. The memoirs were sold door to door by subscription agents in the fashion of the day, and many of those agents were Union veterans themselves, walking small-town streets and knocking on farmhouse doors to sell their old commander's story to families who had lived through the war alongside him. Americans bought them by the hundreds of thousands, roughly 300,000 2-volume sets within 4 years. It became one of the best-selling books the country had ever seen. The profits added up to a fortune, more than $420,000, and by some accounts about $450,000, an almost incomprehensible sum for the era, pouring into the hands of the widow he had fought so hard to protect. Julia Grant would never face poverty again. The last order this old soldier ever gave had been carried out in full, and the book itself, it didn't just sell, it endured. Historians and critics still rank Grant's memoirs among the greatest ever written by a military commander, spoken of in the same breath as Julius Caesar's ancient commentaries on war. Mark Twain himself judged it the most remarkable work of its kind since Caesar. Plain sentences, honest reckoning, little boasting, few excuses, just the story, told by a dying man who refused to leave the work unfinished. Ulysses S. Grant fought his entire life on battlefields most of us will never see. But his final campaign was fought at a small desk on a mountain porch in upstate New York, with failing hands and a failing voice, against an enemy that comes for us all. He can barely speak, he can barely stand, but his hand still moves across the page and the record stands exactly as it always had. Ulysses S. Grant never lost a war, not even his last one.